In the late 18th century, Bernardsville was then a town called VTown, and was the home to the VTown Tavern and Inn. The inn was owned by Captain John Parker, and played host to an array of Continental soldiers during the Revolutionary War, including George Washington and his men on their travels from Princeton to Morristown, New Jersey. In 1777, Captain Parker had a teenage daughter named Phyllis. She also worked in the inn. She fell in love with a local physician named Dr. Aaron Byram. He rented rooms in the inn, but their relationship was not to be. General Anthony Wayne and his men stopped by the inn for a much-needed rest. During their stay, General Wayne discovered some important secret documents missing, and thus conducted a search of the premises. Everyone was questioned and accounted for except Dr. Byram. When Captain Parker described Dr. Byram to the general, the good doctor was discovered to be a British spy named Aaron Wild. Dr. Byram/Wild was soon arrested and the secret documents retrieved. He was tried, convicted, and hanged. In spite of the doctor's crime, Captain Parker wanted to give the man his daughter loved a proper burial. So he had the body retrieved and brought to the inn until it could be buried the following day. At the time, Captain Parker didn't have the heart to tell his daughter the identity of the man in the coffee box, only that he was a British spy. But later that night, Phyllis overheard some men talking about the body, and in a frantic state, she tore open the casket with a hatchet, only to find the body of her lover. It is said that Phyllis went insane with grief and died shortly thereafter. Reports of ghostly phenomenon didn't start until a century later, at which point the VTown Tavern and Inn was being used as a farmhouse. Phantom footsteps, rustling, and windows opening and closing by themselves were reported. In January of 1877, the lady of the house was at home with her small child, when she overheard the sounds of several heavy footsteps carrying something into the kitchen, and then setting something like a large crate on the floor. The footsteps then walked out the back door. In a few moments, the lady then heard the sounds of wood being violently torn apart, which was then followed by a terrifying wail. The wail died down to sobbing before ceasing altogether. Obviously frightened, but desperate to protect her child, the lady investigated where the sounds emanated from and found nothing. The next paranormal incidents occurred in the 1950s, after the farmhouse had been converted into the Bernardsville Public Library. A police officer, in passing, noticed movement in the windows and decided to investigate. The officer canvassed the building and saw the figure of a woman wearing a floor-length white dress. He reported this to a sergeant, who shrugged it off as just a local ghost of Phyllis that most people had seen before, including himself. In the 1970s and 80s, library staff reported many strange occurrences, including spotting a man dressed in 18th century clothing, the sounds of voices murmuring and humming, and phone lines being busy when no one in the building was on the phone. Then, in 1989, a young boy wandered into one of the reading rooms and called his mother over to see the dark-haired lady wearing the long dress. The mother joined her son and saw nothing. It was later learned that the spot where the boy pointed to seeing the lady was the exact spot where Phyllis Parker discovered her lover's body. The ghostly incidents have lessened over the years. But to appease the spirit of Phyllis Parker, the library staff issued her library card. The Hard Rock Cemetery is an old cemetery located at 1502 Road 29 in Chautauqua County, Kansas. It sits in a very remote area right off of gravel-covered Road 29. From Independence Road, turn onto the gravel Road 29 and drive up about 1.5 miles. The cemetery is on the right side. I'll have a modern photo of it posted on anythingghost.com. Just northeast of the cemetery is a wooded area of blackjack oak trees. They cast long, ghostly shadows across the tombstones of the cemetery. On the other side of the cemetery is a sagging old stone fence. In 1902, the cemetery sat just north of what was the Hard Rock Schoolhouse, and it was rumored to be haunted. An urban legend about the Hard Rock Cemetery was about a family living in the area in the early 1800s, the Windsors. One year, the mother of the family became ill and soon passed away. The locals began preparations for the funeral, and the husband decided he didn't want to buy a shroud for his wife's body. So it was decided she would be buried in clothing she wore while she was alive. While Mrs. Windsor was being clothed for the burial, they discovered that her illness caused her feet to swell up, and as a result, her shoes were too small for her. The husband was contacted about this, but rather than purchase new shoes, he decided to force the small ones on her feet. After the church service was over, a slow and solemn funeral procession winded its way to the Hard Rock Cemetery, where Mrs. Windsor's remains were buried. A small mound of dirt was left where she was interred, as sobbing friends and family made their way back to their homes. One evening, shortly after the burial, a group of small men were riding their horses along the dark and lonely gravel stretch of Road 29. Suddenly, one of the young men grabbed a companion by the shoulder and pointed toward the Hard Rock Cemetery. They all looked in the direction of the cemetery and saw, upon a tombstone, a ghost-like figure. The ghost had one slender hand firmly clutching the long white garment that it wore, while the other hand seemed to be pulling at its feet. As the men slowly brought their horses to a stop, the moaning ghost lifted its head up, looked over at the men, and began to slowly rise and move toward them. It began wringing its hands and calling out in agony, "Take off my shoes, please! Oh, please take these tight shoes off! Oh, my shoes, my shoes!" The group commanded their horses to gallop, and they didn't stop until they arrived back home. Two of the men left their horses standing in the barn with saddles and bridles left on them, and ran straight into their house, out of fear of spending any time outside. Many have reported seeing the same ghost, assumed of course to be the ghost of Mrs. Windsor, who is unable to rest peacefully in her grave with the tight shoes on her feet. It's believed the ghost comes back to those who pass the cemetery to get sympathy for her ordeal. Some thought about trying to remove the ghost's shoes, but anyone who considers that is either chased away by her mournful cries, or some say they are chased away by a voice that tells them, "Run." John Welsh was born in Canada in 1866, and then moved to Dalton, Illinois with his parents and 6 other siblings. By 1890, at the age of 24, John Welsh was working as a train conductor for the L.E.W. Railroad in Illinois. One of his brothers also worked for the same railroad. John was unmarried and was known as a sober, industrious, and hard-working young man. On Sunday, March 3, 1889, at around 8 a.m., John Welsh was making a coupling in the rail yards when the thumb of his right finger got caught between 2 deadwoods of 2 cars. The smashed thumb had to be removed by a doctor. A few months later, on Friday, May 17th, Welsh was allowed back as a conductor and took his first train out since his thumb injury. After starting up work again, everything was getting back to normal for John. That is, until the early morning hours of October 3rd, 1889. John was on train number 44, hauling several oil cars and heading eastbound through the township of Arcadia. At one point in the trip, 2 sections of the rail cars broke loose from the engine. John Welsh had to jump into action from the caboose by setting brakes on some of the rail cars to keep them from colliding with the other rail cars and crashing. He had set the brakes on several cars and was headed toward one of the oil-carrying cars when the section of the rail cars that he was on crashed into the middle section of the rail cars. The collision crushed his head between 2 of the cars. John Welsh was unmarried and only 24 years old, the ghost of John Welsh. The Ohio city where John Welsh lost his life was in a township called Arcadia. It sits about 8 miles between two larger cities, Findlay and Fostoria. The railroad tracks that John's train number 44 was on run parallel to Highway 12, which runs right through the middle of all three of these cities. As I said, John had been killed in May of 1889. By January of the following year, 1890, reports were coming in from the Arcadia area about a midnight phantom who was terrorizing employees of the L.E.N.W. Railroad. Trainmen on the L.E.N.W. Railroad between Findlay and Fostoria in Arcadia were greatly disturbed by what they claimed was the ghost of the dead conductor, John Welsh. At that time, there was a dense woods to the side of the tracks. That caused an arch in the track above the rails, and this was where John Welsh met his fate. The midnight train that ran from the waterside city of Sandusky, Ohio, and headed west to that spot where John Welsh lost his life, was where employees would see the headless apparition of John Welsh nearly every night. Engineers and other officials said that when the woods were reached, an object looking like a headless man would come walking slowly out toward the track with a lantern in his hand. The lantern was waving backwards and forwards. The apparition was plainly visible until the engine passed by. At that point, the phantom slowly turned and faded away among the trees. Because of the ghost, the crews who made that trip abandoned that run and were transferred to other divisions of the road. The engineer who brought the train through in mid-January was so terrified over encountering the headless conductor that when he reached the next stop, they had a difficult time convincing him to continue on to the final destination of Lima. He said he would not go through that experience again for any amount of money. No other trains were annoyed by the ghostly conductor, but that was explained by the fact that no other crew at that hour passed that spot where John Welsh lost his life. Employees became very concerned about experiencing the ghost, and unless something was done about the spirit of John Welsh, it appeared that the midnight train was going to have to be abandoned. Now keep in mind this was 1890. The electric light bulb had only been invented 10 years prior. And that train would run through the area at 1 in the morning. So there weren't any city lights. The only light on those tracks were the headlights from the engine. The conductor would be by himself in the dark, maybe a dim yellow light bulb in front of him. Nothing but the sounds of the train around him. And then, in the headlights, he saw a headless body with a lantern walking toward the tracks. If you ever happen to be in Ohio on the 12th highway between midnight and 1 in the morning, and you're heading west from Sandusky, Ohio, if you happen to hit some dense woods just outside the small township of Arcadia, pull your car over to the side of the road and take a look to the north, toward the railroad tracks. You just may see the headless ghost of the 24-year-old L.E.N.W. railroad conductor, John Welsh. When I was a little girl, my father rented the old-fashioned house on Hempstead Harbor, Long Island, New York. It's a beautiful place, with large grounds and had a magnificent view of the ocean. The ground floor of the house consisted of a front parlor, a library, a dining room, a kitchen, and a small room that opened up off the library. The small room had been used as a sitting room by the previous owner. The house was partially furnished when we moved in, and we decided to use some of that furniture. In the little room off the library, there had been an old-fashioned rocking chair with a cane back and upholstered seat. Father fitted up the little room as a smoking room, or as a den, as he called it. But it was such a pleasant and sunny room that I spent considerable part of my days there, reading and sewing. The little rocking chair I considered my special property, and at my request, my father let it remain in the room for my use. One rainy evening, several months after our arrival, Mother and I were in the house alone. Mother was suffering from a sick headache. My sister Mabel was away on a visit, and father was detained in the city on business. That evening, I was in my mother's room reading to her, for, as I had said, it was my usual custom to spend my evening in the little sitting room off the library. Mother's room was directly over this, and any sounds that would have come from it we could have heard very plainly. Our servants were out for the evening, as it was their night off, till again we were in the house alone. While I was reading the story to my mother, I was suddenly surprised to hear the soft sound of someone singing in a low female voice. The singing appeared to be coming from the little smoking room below us. Mother heard the singing as well, and she asked me what it was. I thought it was very strange, but didn't think that it was anything supernatural. In fact, such a thought never crossed my mind. The singing went on from a high pitch to a low pitch, as the voice of the singer rose and fell. My mother then asked me if someone was singing outside, but I told her that I was certain the voice was coming from down in father's smoking room. I finally decided to go and investigate who the singer was. I went downstairs, and when I reached the smoking room, I paused for a moment at the closed door. I had to think hard, as I could not recall closing the door to the smoking room before heading up to mother's room. As I stood there, I could clearly tell the song was indeed coming from the smoking room. The song sounded like an old lullaby, and I could also hear the creaking of the rocking chair moving back and forth. In my head, I pictured someone singing to put a baby to sleep. I slowly opened the door and paused before entering the room. The singing continued. I will never forget the strange feeling that came over me when I stepped into the room. I seemed to know there was another presence in that room. I could not see it. I reached over and turned on the light switch. The singing stopped. There was nobody in the room. It was just as I had left it. I stood there for a few moments and went back out of the room as if nothing unusual had happened. Next, instead of heading back upstairs, I decided to wait in the library and watch the room through the open door. And then a strange thing happened. The rocking chair began to move slowly, back and forth. It rocked and rocked. Then very slowly, and almost indistinctly at first, came the song of the invisible singer. I didn't stand there waiting any longer. I stormed out of the library and up the stairs to mother. I told her that one of the girls was back and was singing in the library. I lied, because I didn't want to frighten her. She was feeling too ill for a surprise. She accepted my explanation. For the next few hours, we heard the rocking chair singer, but it finally completely stopped after my father returned home. I told my father what had happened, and the next day we moved out. We learned afterward that the house was known to be haunted. A young married couple had lived there many years before, and that smoking room was the wife's favorite place in the house. The couple had a baby, but he became sick a few months after his birth, and he died shortly afterward. The young wife was stricken with grief, and she also died a short time after the death of her baby. Those who knew of the story said that on the anniversary of her death, the song she used to sing to her baby could be heard coming from that room, accompanied with the sound of the rocking chair moving back and forth. Other occupants of the house had the same experience as I did. Where I used to live in Pennsylvania, there was a building just down the hill from where I used to live. This building had been a butcher's shop for decades. The owner was the grandson of the original owner and had moved the shop across town around 1967. For about 10 years after that, it was used as a mechanic's shop due to the unique layout of the building in that it was basically a split level and allowed for vehicles to be pulled into the garage from the above street and then serviced from the lower level. In the late 70s, the mechanic moved to a neighboring town, so the shop near us was shut down. The building was left unattended for several years until the mid-80s when a squatter began to live there. He was a homeless man who would do odd jobs for the people who lived in town and around it. Everyone called him Ed, and apparently he had done some work for the mechanic's shop and was a World War II veteran who hadn't come back from the war in a great mental state. In the early 90s, a group of teenagers began to bother this guy. They'd throw garbage at him, taunt him, and occasionally chase him. Never much more than that until one day when they cornered the poor dude in the upper level of the old shop. One of them began to beat him with an old broomstick. The guy was pushing 70 to begin with and couldn't do much to fight back. A neighbor saw the fight unfold and had called the police. Even before the true beating had really started. The police showed up and scared away the teenagers, arresting one for possession, and began to look for Ed to make sure he was okay. But they never found him. For a while everyone just assumed that he had ran off, until a resident of one of the buildings near the old shop reported a horrible smell seeping from the lower level, where the old oil pit was, of the shop. There in the mixture of blood and dirt was Ed. Most of the oil had seeped out, I'd been told. The body was in a horrible state of decay for being dead for about a month, but it appeared he had sustained a tremendous beating. There was no autopsy performed and people began to reach out to Ed's family to tell them he had died. They couldn't find any except a woman in her early 90s who supposedly had some relation to Ed. The woman identified Ed as her younger cousin, but didn't know much of him beyond that and had only met him once or twice. Ed was buried and the teenagers were tried for various crimes ranging from accidental death to the aforementioned possession charges. Oddly, they were acquitted for the most part. Only the possession ended up sticking due to the fact that no autopsy had been performed at the time of death and the fact that the teens were all minors between 13 and 15. There was also a mistake in the processing of the individuals, which led to one of the teens being beaten severely at the hands of an adult who may or may not have been a cop at the time. This led to dismissals for everything but possession. Time passed and the incident was largely forgotten. In the early 2000s, the butcher finally passed away. He was a fairly prominent man in town at this point, as he'd been there for decades, as had his father and grandfather. His son wasn't carrying on the business and decided to hold a memorial for his dad in the old shop. He and a few friends went and began to clean up the place to make room for guests. They had to install a new front door on the upper level as the old one was completely demolished from years of neglect. During this process, they unearthed an old metal container that had been cemented directly into the wall. This container had photographs of the dad and his father from the 50s when they began to work together. The son decided they would be great for the memorial, so he had a few of them blown up to poster size and displayed a few of them at the memorial. Also included in the box was a diary that hadn't been touched in 40+ years. The day of the memorial, people began to notice another man showing up from time to time in more than a few of the photos. Sure enough, there was Ed. He had worked for the second-generation butcher for about a decade right after World War II and had been present when the third-gen butcher began to run the shop. The son, upon reading his father's diary, learned that they began to have a severe hatred for each other around the mid-60s when his grandfather retired from the shop, and they had gotten into several fights beforehand. The last entry was about the move across town. The third-gen butcher had wrote, "I can't take it anymore, we have to leave." This puzzled the son, who began to backtrack and figure out what happened. Apparently, the butcher had gotten into a physical altercation with Ed that resulted in Ed being hit in the back of the head with a cleaver. The butcher wrote, "I can tell no one this as it will ruin my entire family, but I've buried him in the blood pit. The shop will mask the smell and I don't think anyone will miss him. May God have mercy on my soul." When the auto shop took over, they ended up filling this pit with oil and other debris to drown out the smell of animal blood/parts, and it filled a hole around 6 inches deep. Once the oil had completely seeped through the surrounding soil, it had apparently weakened its integrity and allowed the wall to partially collapse, revealing the hideously decayed corpse of Ed. The son decided to speak to the medical examiner who had seen Ed's body and began the process to have Ed exhumed. He wanted to either confirm the claim or clear his father's good name. The cousin had since died and no one opposed the exhumation, so they brought up the coffin. The examiner went over the corpse again, and sure enough, he began to see that Ed had died more from sharp force trauma than from any sort of blunt trauma. He also began to analyze more closely the remaining tissue and noted that it was completely drenched in oil and was far better preserved than it had any right to be. The debris the auto shop had loaded on top of Ed, inadvertently, had basically delayed the decay that he should have been experiencing. The teens had surely been beating somebody that day. The police began to look for the teens to question them. The story unfolded in a grotesque manner. The police report indicated that the teens claimed an elderly man had been following them and had chased them into the old shop. They claimed to be defending themselves and ran away at the first chance they got. There were 4 teens mentioned in the police report. All were now dead. They had all committed suicide in different manners. One had jumped into the river at the nearby dam and drowned, one had hung herself, one had sat in their garage with the car running, and the last had slit his wrists. They all had one thing in common, however. Each had complained of a person following them for years after the beating incident. Occasionally they would note someone seemed to follow them home from work or school in the same car day after day, week after week. Sometimes it would be someone at the mall, or a creepy person outside their house. Of the 4, only one left any sort of indication of a note after suicide. Scrawled in blood on the bathroom wall beside the corpse of the last person to kill himself were the sloppy yet legible words, "Thank you, ED."